Over the River and Through the Woods by Clifford D. Simak. The two children came trudging down the lane in apple canning time, when the first goldenrods were blooming and the wild asters large in bud. They looked, when she first saw them out the kitchen window, like children who were coming home from school, for each of them was carrying a bag in which might have been their books, like Charles and James, she thought, like Alice and Maggie. But the time when those four had trudged the lane on their daily trips to school was in the distant past. Now they had children of their own who made their way to school. She turned back to the stove to stir the cooking apples, for which the wide-mouthed jars stood waiting on the table. Then once more looked out the kitchen window. The two of them were closer now, and she could see that the boy was the older of the two, 10 perhaps, and the girl no more than 8. They might be going past, she thought, although it did not seem too likely, for the lane led to this farm and to nowhere else. They turned off the lane before they reached the barn and came sturdily trudging up the path that led to the house. There was no hesitation in them. They knew where they were going. She stepped at the screen door of the kitchen as they came onto the porch, and they stopped before the door and stood looking up at her. The boy said, "You are our grandma. Papa said we were to say it once, that you were our grandma." "But that's not," she said, and stopped. She had been about to say it was impossible, that she was not their grandma. And looking down into the sober, childish faces, she was glad she had not said that. "I am Ellen," said the girl in a piping voice. "Why, that is strange," the woman said. "That is my name, too." The boy said, "My name is Paul." She pushed open the door for them, and they came in, standing silently in the kitchen, looking all about them as if they'd never seen a kitchen. "It's just like Papa said," said Ellen. "There's the stove and the churn and—" The boy interrupted her. "Our name is Forbes," he said. This time the woman couldn't stop herself. "Why, that's impossible," she said. "That is our name, too." The boy nodded solemnly. "Yes, we know it was." "Perhaps," the woman said, "you'd like some milk and cookies." "Cookies!" Ellen squealed, delighted. "We don't want to be any trouble," said the boy. "Papa said we were to be no trouble." "He said we should be good," piped Ellen. "I am sure you will be," said the woman. "And you are no trouble." In a little while, she thought, she'd get it straightened out. She went to the stove and set the kettle with the cooking apples to one side, where they would simmer slowly. "Sit down at the table," she said. "I'll get the milk and cookies." She glanced at the clock, ticking on the shelf. 4 o'clock, almost. In just a little while the men would come in from the fields. Jackson Forbes would know what to do about this. He had always known. They climbed up on 2 chairs and sat there solemnly, staring all about them at the ticking clock, at the wood stove with the fire glow showing through its draught, at the wood piled in the wood box, at the butter churn standing in the corner. They set their bags on the floor beside them, and they were strange bags, she noticed. They were made of heavy cloth or canvas, but there were no drawstrings or no straps to fasten them. But they were closed, she saw, despite no straps or strings. "Do you have some stamps?" asked Ellen. "Stamps?" asked Mrs. Forbes. "You must pay no attention to her," said Paul. "She should not have asked you. She asks everyone, and Mama told her not to." "But stamps?" "She collects them. She goes around snitching letters that other people have, for the stamps on them, you know." "Well, now," said Mrs. Forbes, "there may be some old letters. We'll look for them later on." She went into the pantry and got the earthen jug of milk and filled a plate with cookies from the jar. When she came back, they were sitting there sedately, waiting for the cookies. "We are here just for a little while," said Paul. "Just a short vacation, then our folks will come and get us and take us back again." Ellen nodded her head vigorously. "That's what they told us when we went, when I was afraid to go." "You were afraid to go?" "Yes, it was all so strange." "There was so little time," said Paul. "Almost none at all. We had to leave so fast." "And where are you from?" asked Mrs. Forbes. "Why," said the boy, "just a little ways from here. We walked just a little ways, and of course we had the map. Papa gave it to us, and he went over it carefully with us." "You're sure your name is Forbes?" Ellen bobbed her head. "Of course it is," she said. "Strange," said Mrs. Forbes. And it was more than strange, for there were no other Forbeses in the neighborhood except her children and her grandchildren, and these two, no matter what they said, were strangers. They were busy with the milk and cookies, and she went back to the stove and set the kettle with the apples back on the front again, stirring the cooking fruit with a wooden spoon. "Where is Grandpa?" Ellen asked. "Grandpa's in the field. He'll be coming in soon. Are you finished with your cookies?" "All finished," said the girl. "Then we'll have to set the table and get the supper cooking. Perhaps you'd like to help me." Ellen hopped down off the chair. "I'll help," she said. "And I," said Paul, "will carry in some wood. Papa said I should be helpful. He said I should carry in the wood and feed the chickens and hunt the eggs and—" "Paul," said Mrs. Forbes, "it might help if you'd tell me what your father does." "Papa," said the boy, "is a temporal engineer." The two hired men sat at the kitchen table with the checkerboard between them. The two older people were in the living room. "You never saw the likes of it," said Mrs. Forbes. "There was this piece of metal, and you pulled it, and it ran along another metal strip, and the bag came open. And you pulled it the other way, the bag was closed." "Something new," said Jackson Forbes. "There may be many new things we haven't heard about back here in the sticks. There are inventors turning out all sorts of things." "And the boy," she said, "has the same thing on his trousers. I picked them up from where he threw them on the floor when he went to bed, and I folded them and put them on the chair, and I saw this strip of metal, the edges jagged-like, and the clothes they wear. That boy's trousers were cut off above the knees, and the dress the girl was wearing was so short." "They talked of planes," mused Jackson Forbes, "but not the planes we know, something that is used, apparently for folks to travel in. And rockets, as if there were rockets every day and not just on the 4th. "We couldn't question them, of course," said Mrs. Forbes. "There was something about them, something that I sensed." Her husband nodded. They were frightened, too. "You are frightened, Jackson?" "I don't know," he said. "But there are no other Forbeses. Not close, that is. Charlie is the closest, and he's 5 miles away. And they said they walked just a little piece." "What are you going to do?" she asked. "What can we do?" "I don't rightly know," he said. "Drive into the county seat and talk with the sheriff, maybe. These children must be lost. There must be someone looking for them." "But they don't act as if they're lost," she told him. "They knew they were coming here. They knew we would be here. They told me I was their grandma, and they asked after you, and they called you Grandpa. And they are so sure. They don't act as if we're strangers. They've been told about us. They say they'd stay just a little while, and that's the way they act, as if they'd just come for a visit." "I think," said Jackson Forbes, "that I'll hitch up Nellie after breakfast and drive around the neighborhood and ask some questions. Maybe there'll be someone who can tell me something." "The boy said his father was a temporal engineer. That just don't make sense. Temporal means the worldly power and authority and—" "It might be some joke," her husband said. "Something that the father said in jest and then the son picked up as truth." "I think," said Mrs. Forbes, "I'll go upstairs and see if they're asleep. I left their lamps turned low." They're so little, and the house is strange to them. If they are asleep, I'll blow out the lamps. Jackson Forbes grunted his approval. Dangerous, he said, to keep lights burning of the night. Too much chance of fire. The boy was asleep, flat upon his back, the deep and healthy sleep of youngsters. He had thrown his clothes upon the floor when he had undressed to go to bed, and now they were folded neatly on the chair where she had placed them when she had gone into the room to say good night. The bag stood beside the chair, and it was open, the 2 rows of jagged metal gleaming dully in the dim glow of the lamp. Within its shadowed interior lay the dark forms of jumbled possessions, disorderly and helter-skelter. No way for a bag to be. She stooped and picked up the bag and set it on the chair and reached for the little metal tab to close it. At least, she told herself, it should be closed and not left standing open. She grasped the tab and slid it smoothly along the metal tracks and then stopped, its course obstructed by an object that stuck out. She saw it was a book and reached down to rearrange it so she could close the bag. And as she did so, she saw the title in its faint gold lettering across the leather backstrap. Holy Bible. With her fingers grasping the book, she hesitated for a moment, then slowly drew it out. It was bound in an expensive black leather that was dulled with age. The edges were cracked and split, and the leather worn from long usage. The gold edging of the leaves was faded. Hesitantly, she opened it, and there, upon the flyleaf, in old and faded ink, was the inscription, To Sister Ellen, from Amelia, October 30th, 1896. Many happy returns of the day. She felt her knees grow weak, and she let herself carefully to the floor, and there, crouched beside the chair, read the flyleaf once again. October 30th, 1896. That was her birthday. Certainly, but it had not come as yet, for this was only the beginning of September, 1896. And the Bible. How old was this Bible she held within her hands? 100 years? Perhaps more than 100 years? A Bible, she thought, exactly the kind of gift Amelia would give her. But a gift that had not been given yet, one that could not be given, for that day upon the flyleaf was a month into the future. It couldn't be, of course. It was some kind of stupid joke, or some mistake, or a coincidence, perhaps. Somewhere else, someone else was named Ellen and also had a sister who was named Amelia, and the date was a mistake. Someone had written the wrong year. It would be an easy thing to do, but she was not convinced. They had said the name was Forbes, and they had come straight here, and Paul had spoken of a map so they could find the way. Perhaps there were other things inside the bag. She looked at it and shook her head. She shouldn't pry. It had been wrong to take the Bible out. On October 30th, she would be 59. An old farm wife with married sons and daughters and grandchildren who came to visit her on weekends and on holidays. And a sister, Amelia, who in this year of 1896 would give her a Bible as a birthday gift. Her hands shook as she lifted the Bible and put it back into the bag. She'd talk to Jackson when she went downstairs. He might have some thought about the matter, and he'd know what to do. She tucked the book back into the bag and pulled the tab, and the bag was closed. She sat on the floor again and looked at the boy upon the bed. He still was fast asleep, so she blew out the light. In the adjoining room, little Ellen slept, baby-like, upon her stomach. The low flame of the turned-down lamp flickered gustily in the breeze that came through an open window. Ellen's bag was closed and stood squared against the chair with a sense of neatness. The woman looked at it and hesitated for a moment, then moved on around the bed to where the lamp stood on a bedside table. The children were asleep, and everything was well, and she'd blow out the light and go downstairs and talk with Jackson. And perhaps there'd be no need for him to hitch up Nellie in the morning and drive around and ask questions of the neighbors. As she leaned to blow out the lamp, she saw the envelope upon the table, with the 2 large stamps of many colors affixed to the upper right-hand corner. Such pretty stamps, she thought. I never saw so pretty. She leaned closer to take a look at them and saw the country name upon them. Israel. But there was no such actual place as Israel. It was a Bible name. But there was no country. And if there were no country, how could there be stamps? She picked up the envelope and studied the stamp, making sure that she had seen right. Such a pretty stamp. She collects them, Paul had said. She's always snitching letters that belong to other people. The envelope bore a postmark and presumably a date, but it was blurred and distorted by a hasty, sloppy cancellation, and she could not make it out. The edge of the letter sheet stuck a 1/4 inch out of the ragged edges where the envelope had been torn open, and she pulled it out, gasping in her haste to see it, while an icy fist of fear was clutching at her heart. It was, she saw, only the end of a letter, the last page of a letter, and it was in type rather than in longhand, type like one saw in a newspaper or a book. Maybe one of those newfangled things they had in big city offices, she thought, the ones she'd read about. Typewriters. Was that what they were called? Do not believe. The one page read, "Your plan is feasible. There is no time. The aliens are closing in, and they will not give us time. And there is the further consideration of the ethics of it, even if it could be done. We cannot, in all consciousness, scurry back into the past and visit our problems upon the people of a century ago. Think of the problems it would create for them, the economic confusion, and the psychological effect. If you feel that you must at least send the children back, think a moment of the wrench it will give those 2 good souls when they realize the truth. Theirs is a smug and solid world, sure and safe and sound. The concepts of this mad century would destroy all they have, all that they believe in. But I suppose I cannot presume to counsel you. I have done what you asked. I have written you all I know of our old ancestors back on that Wisconsin farm. As historian of the family, I am sure my facts are right. Use them as you see fit, and God have mercy on us all, your loving brother, Jackson. P.S. A suggestion. If you do send the children back, you might send along with them a generous supply of the new cancer-inhibiting drug. Great-great-grandmother Forbes died in 1904 of a condition that I suspect was cancer. Given those pills, she might survive another 10 or 20 years. And what, I ask you, brother, would that mean to this tangled future? I don't pretend to know. It might save us. It might kill us quicker. It might have no effect at all. I leave the puzzle to you. If I can finish up work here and get away, I'll be with you at the end. Mechanically, she slid the letter back into the envelope and laid it upon the table beside the flaring lamp. Slowly, she moved to the window that looked out on the empty lane. They will come and get us, Paul had said. But would they ever come? Could they ever come? She found herself wishing they would come, those poor people, those poor frightened children caught so far in time. Blood of my blood, she thought, flesh of my flesh. So many years away. But still her flesh and blood, no matter how removed. Not only these 2 beneath this roof tonight, but all those others who had not come to her. The letter had said 1904, and cancer, and that was 8 years away. She'd be an old, old woman then. And the signature had been Jackson, an old family name, she wondered, carried on and on. A long chain of people who bore the name of Jackson Forbes. She was stiff and numb, she knew. Later she'd be frightened. Later she would wish she had not read the letter, did not know. But now she must go back downstairs and tell Jackson the best way that she could. She moved across the room and blew out the light and went out into the hallway. a voice came from the open door beyond. "Grandma, is that you?" "Yes, Paul," she answered. "What can I do for you?" In the doorway, she saw him crouched beside the chair in the shaft of moonlight pouring through the window, fumbling at the bag. "I forgot," he said. "There was something Papa said I was to give you right away." Founding Father by Clifford D. Simak. Winston Kirby walked home across the moor just before the twilight hour, and it was then he felt that the land was at its best. The sun was sinking into a crimson froth of clouds, and the first gray-silver light began to run across the swales. There were moments when it seemed all eternity grew quiet and watched with held breath. It had been a good day, and it would be a good homecoming, for the others would be waiting for him with the dinner table set, and the fireplace blazing, and the drinks set close at hand. It was a pity, he thought, that they would not go walking with him, although in this particular instance he was rather glad they hadn't. Once in a while it was a good thing for a man to be alone. For almost 100 years aboard the ship, there had been no chance to be alone. But that was over now, and they could settle down, just the 6 of them, to lead the kind of life they'd planned. After only a few short weeks, the planet was beginning to seem like home. In the years to come, it would become, in truth, a home such as Earth had never been. Once again he felt the twinge of recurring wonder at how they'd ever got away with it. That Earth should allow 6 of its immortals to slip through its clutches seemed unbelievable. Earth had real and urgent need for all of its immortals, and that not one but 6 of them should be allowed to slip away. To live lives of their own was beyond all logic, and yet that was exactly what had happened. There was something queer about it, Winston Kirby told himself. On the century-long flight from Earth, they'd often talked about it and wondered how it had come about. Cranford Adams, he recalled, had been convinced that it was some subtle trap, but after 100 years there was no evidence of any trap, and it had begun to seem Cranford Adams must be wrong. Winston Kirby topped the gentle rise that he had been climbing, and in the gathering dusk he saw the manor house, exactly the kind of house he had dreamed about for years, precisely the kind of house to be built in such a setting, except that the robots had built it much too large. But that, he consoled himself, was what one had to expect of robots. Efficient, certainly, and very well-intentioned and obedient and nice to have around, but sometimes pretty stupid. He stood on the hilltop and gazed down upon the house. How many times had he and his companions at the dinner table planned the kind of house they would build? How often had they speculated upon the accuracy of the specifications given for this planet they had chosen from the exploratory files, fearful that it might not be in every actuality the way it was described. But here, finally, it was. Something out of Hardy, something from the Baskervilles, the long imagining come to comfortable reality. There was the manor house, with the light shining from its windows, and the dark bulk of the outbuildings built to house the livestock, which had been brought in the ship as frozen embryos, and soon would be emerging from the incubators. And there the level land that in a few more months would be fields and gardens. And to the north, the spaceship stood after years of roving. He walked down the hill, with the first night wind blowing in his face, and the ancient smell of heather in the air, and was happy and exultant. It was sinful, he thought, to be so joyful, but there was reason for it. The voyage had been happy, and the planet strike successful, and here he was, the undisputed proprietor of an entire planet upon which, in the fullness of time, he would found a family and a dynasty, and he had all the time there was. There was no need to hurry. He had all of eternity if he needed it. And best of all, he had good companions. They would be waiting for him when he stepped through the door. There would be laughter and a quick drink, then a leisurely dinner, and later brandy before the blazing fire. And there'd be talk, good talk, sober and intimate and friendly. It had been the talk, he told himself, more than anything else, which had gotten them sanely through the century of spaceflight. That and their mutual love and appreciation of the finer points of the human culture, understanding of the arts, love of good literature, interest in philosophy. It was not often that 6 persons could live intimately for 100 years without a single spat, without a touch of cabin fever. Inside the manor house, they would be waiting for him in the fire and candlelight, with the drinks all mixed and the talk already started, and the room would be warm with good fellowship and perfect understanding. Cranford Adams would be sitting in the big chair before the fire, staring at the flames and thinking, for he was the thinker of the group. And Alan Burbage would be standing, with one elbow on the mantel, a glass clutched in his hand, and in his eyes the twinkle of good humor. Cosette Middleton would be talking with him and laughing, for she was the gay one, with her elfin spirit and her golden hair. Anna Quinns, more than likely, would be reading, curled up in a chair, and Mary Foyle would be simply waiting, glad to be alive, glad to be with friends. These, he thought, were the long companions of the trip, so full of understanding, so tolerant and gracious, that a century had not dulled the beauty of their friendship. Winston Kirby hurried, a thing he almost never did, at the thought of those 5 who were waiting for him, anxious to be with them, to tell them of his walk across the moor, to discuss with them still again some details of their plans. He turned into the walk. The wind was becoming cold, as it always did with the fall of darkness, and he raised the collar of his jacket for the poor protection it afforded. He reached the door and stood for an instant in the chill, to savor the never-failing satisfaction of the massive timbering and the stout, strong squareness of the house. A place built to stand through the centuries, he thought. A place of dynasty with a sense of foreverness. He pressed the latch and thrust his weight against the door, and it came slowly open. A blast of warm air rushed out to greet him. He stepped into the entry hall and closed the door behind him. As he took off his cap and jacket and found a place to hang them, he stamped and scuffed his feet a little to let the others know that he had returned. But there were no greetings for him, no sound of happy laughter. There was only silence from the inner room. He turned about so swiftly that his hand trailed across his jacket and dislodged it from the hook. It fell to the floor with a smooth rustle of fabric and lay there, a little mound of cloth. His legs, suddenly, were cold and heavy, and when he tried to hurry, the best he could do was shuffle, and he felt the chill edge of fear. He reached the entrance to the room and stopped, shocked into immobility. His hands went out and grasped to the door jamb on either side of him. There was no one in the room. And not only that, the room itself was different. It was not simply the companions who were gone. Gone as well were the rich furnishings of the room, gone the comfort and the pride. There were no rugs upon the floor, no hangings at the windows, no paintings on the wall. The fireplace was a naked thing of rough and jagged stone. The furniture, the little there was primitive, barely knocked together. A small trestle table stood before the fireplace, with a 3-legged stool pulled up to a place that was set for one. Winston Kirby tried to call. The first time the words gurgled in his throat and he could not get them out. He tried again and made it. "Job! Job! Where are you?" Job came running from somewhere in the house. "What's the trouble, sir?" "Where are the others? Where have they gone? They should be waiting for me." Job shook his head just slightly. A quick move right and left. "Mr. Kirby. Sir, they were never here.
Never here? But they were here. When I left this morning, they knew I'd be coming back.
You fail to understand, sir. There were never any others. There was just you and I and the other robots and the embryos, of course. Winston Kirby let go of the door and walked a few feet forward.
Job, he said, you're joking.
But he knew something was wrong. Robots never joke.
We let you keep them as long as we could, said Job. We hated to have to take them from you, sir, but we needed the equipment for the incubators.
But this room, the rugs, the furniture...
That was all part of it, sir. Part of the Dimensino.
Winston Kirby walked slowly across the room, used one foot to hook the three-legged stool out from the table. He sat down heavily.
The Dimensino? He asked. Surely you remember.
He frowned to indicate he didn't, but it was coming back to him, some of it, slowly and reluctantly, emerging vaguely after all the years of forgetfulness. He fought against the remembering and the knowledge. He tried to push it back into that dark corner of his mind from which it came. It was sacrilege and treason. It was madness.
The human embryos, Job told him, came through very well. Of the 1,000 of them, all but 3 are viable.
Winston Kirby shook his head as if to clear away the mist that befogged his brain.
We have the incubators all set up in the outbuildings, sir, said Job. We waited as long as we could before we took the Dimensino equipment. We let you have it until the very last. It might have been easier, sir, if we could have done it gradually, but there is no provision for that. You either have Dimensino or you haven't got it.
Of course, said Winston Kirby, mumbling just a little. It was considerate of you. I thank you very much. He stood up unsteadily and rubbed his hand across his eyes.
It's not possible, he said. It simply can't be possible. I lived for 100 years with them. They were as real as I am. They were flesh and blood. I tell you, they were...
The room still was bare and empty, a mocking emptiness, an alien mockery.
It is possible, said Job gently. It is just the way it should be.
Everything has been according to the book. You are here, still sane, thanks to the Dimensino. The embryos came through better than expected. The equipment is intact. In 8 months or so, the children will be coming from the incubators. By that time, we will have gardens and a crop on the way. The livestock embryos will also have emerged, and the colony will be largely self-sustaining. Winston Kirby strode to the table, picked up the plate that was laid at the single place. It was lightweight plastic.
Tell me, he said, have we any china? Have we any glassware or silver?
Job looked as near to startled as a robot ever could.
Of course not, sir. We had no room for more than just the bare essentials this trip. The china, the silver, and all the rest of it will have to wait until much later.
And I have been eating ship rations?
Naturally, said Job. There was so little room and so much we had to take.
Winston Kirby stood with the plate in his hand, tapping it gently on the table, remembering those other dinners aboard the ship and since the ship had landed. The steaming soup in its satiny tureen, the pink and juicy prime ribs, the huge potatoes baked to a mealy turn, the crisp green lettuce, the shine of polished silver, the soft sheen of good china, the...
Job, he said. Sir.
It was all delusion, then.
I'm afraid it was. I am sorry, sir.
And the robots?
All of us are fine, sir. It was different with us. We can face reality.
And humans can't.
Sometimes it is better if they can be protected from it.
But not now?
Not anymore, said Job. It must be faced now, sir.
Winston Kirby laid the plate down on the table and turned back to the robot. I think I'll go up to my room and change to other clothes. I presume dinner will be ready soon. Ship rations, doubtless.
A special treat tonight,
Job told him.
Hezekiah found some lichens, and I've made a pot of soup. Splendid, Winston Kirby said, trying not to gag.
He climbed the stairs to the door at the head of the stairs. As he was about to go into the room, another robot came tramping down the hall.
Good evening, sir, it said.
And who are you?
I'm Solomon, said the robot. I'm fixing up the nurseries. Soundproofing them, I hope. Oh, nothing like that. We haven't the material or time. Well, carry on, said Winston Kirby, and went into the room. It was not his room at all. It was small and plain. There was a bunk instead of the great four-poster he had been sleeping in, and there were no rugs, no full-length mirror, no easy chairs. Delusion, he had said, not really believing it. But here there was no delusion. The room was cold with a dread reality, a reality he knew that had been long delayed. In the loneliness of this tiny room, he came face to face with it and felt the sick sense of loss. It was a reckoning that had been extended into the future as far as it might be, and extended not alone as a matter of mercy, of mere consideration, but because of a cold, hard necessity, a practical concession to human vulnerability. For no man, no matter how well adjusted, no matter if immortal, could survive intact, in mind and body, a trip such as he had made. To survive a century under space conditions, there must be delusion and companionship to provide security and purpose from day to day. And that companionship must be more than human. For mere human companionship, however ideal, would give rise to countless irritations, would breed deadly cabin fever. Dimensino companionship was the answer, then, providing an illusion of companionship flexible to every mood and need of the human subject, providing as well a background to that companionship, a wish-fulfillment way of life that nailed down security such as humans under normal circumstances never could have known. He sat down on the bunk and began to unlace his heavy walking shoes. The practical human race, he thought. Practical to the point of fooling itself to reach destination. Practical to the point of fabricating the Dimensino equipment to specifications which could be utilized upon arrival in the incubators. But willing to gamble when there was a need to gamble. Ready to bet that a man could survive a century in space if he were sufficiently insulated against reality. Insulated by seeming flesh and blood which, in sober fact, existed only by the courtesy of the human mind, assisted by intricate electronics. For no ship before had ever gone so far on a colonizing mission. No man had ever existed for even half as long under the influence of Dimensino. But there were few planets where man might plant a colony under natural conditions, without extensive and expensive installations and precautions. The nearer of these planets had been colonized, and the survey had shown that this one, which he finally had reached, was especially attractive. So Earth and man had bet. Especially one man, Winston Kirby told himself with pride. But the pride was bitter in his mouth. The odds, he recalled, had been 5-3 against him. And yet, even in his bitterness, he recognized the significance of what he had done. It was another breakthrough, another triumph for the busy little brain that was hammering at the door of all eternity. It meant that the galaxy was open, that Earth could remain the center of an expanding empire, that Dimensino and Immortal could travel to the very edge of space, that the seed of man would be scattered wide and far, traveling as frozen embryos through the cold black distance, which hurt the mind to think of. He went to the small chest of drawers and found a change of clothing, laid it on the bunk, and began to take off his hiking outfit. Everything was going according to the book, Job had said. The house was bigger than he had wanted it, but the robots had been right. A big building would be needed to house 1,000 babies.
The incubators were set up, and the nurseries were being readied, and another far Earth colony was getting underway. And colonies were important, he remembered, reaching back into that day 100 years before, when he and many others had laid their plans, including the plan whereby he could delude himself and thus preserve his sanity. For with more and more of the immortal mutations occurring, the day was not too distant when the human race would require all the room that it could grab. And it was the mutant immortals who were the key persons in the colonizing programs, going out as founding fathers to supervise the beginning of each colony, staying on as long as needed to act as a sort of elder statesman until that day when the colony could stand on its own feet. There would be busy years ahead, he knew, serving as father, proctor, judge, sage, and administrator, a sort of glorified old man of a brand new tribe. He pulled on his trousers, scuffed his feet into his shoes, rose to tuck in his shirt tail, and he turned by force of habit to the full-length mirror. And the glass was there. He stood astounded, gaping foolishly at the image of himself, and behind him in the glass he saw the great four-poster and the easy chairs. He swung around, and the bed and chairs were gone. There were just the bunk and the chest of drawers in the small, mean room. Slowly he sat down on the edge of the bunk, clasping his hands so they wouldn't shake. It wasn't true. It couldn't be. The Dimensino was gone. And yet it was with him, still lurking in his brain, just around the corner if he would only try. He tried, and it was easy. The room changed as he remembered it, with the full-length mirror and the massive bed upon which he sat, the thick rugs, the gleaming liquor cabinet, and the tasteful drapes. He tried to make it go away, barely remembering back in some deep black closet of his mind that he must make it go. But it wouldn't go away. He tried and tried again, and it still was there, and he felt the will to make it go slipping from his consciousness. "No!" he cried in terror, and the terror did it. He sat in the small, bare room. He found that he was breathing hard, as if he'd climbed a high, steep hill. His hands were fists, and his teeth were clenched, and he felt the sweat trickling down his ribs. It would be easy, he thought, so easy and so pleasant to slip back to the old security, to the warm, deep friendship, to the lack of pressing purpose. But he must not do it, for here was a job to do. Distasteful as it seemed now, as cold, as barren, it still was something he must do. For it was more than just one more colony. It was the breakthrough, the sure and certain knowledge, the proved knowledge that man no longer was chained by time or distance. And yet there was this danger to be recognized. It was not something on which one might shut one's mind. It must be reported in every clinical detail so that, back on Earth, it might be studied and the inherent menace somehow remedied or removed. Side effect, he wondered, or simply a matter of learning. For the Dimensino was no more than an aid to the human mind, an aid to a very curious end, the production of controlled hallucinations operating on the wish-fulfillment level. After 100 years, perhaps, the human mind had learned the technique well, so well that there was no longer need of the Dimensino. It was something he should have realized, he insisted to himself. He had gone on long walks, and during all those hours alone, the delusion had not faded. It had taken the sudden shock of silence and emptiness, where he had expected laughter and warm greeting, to penetrate the haze of delusion in which he'd walked for years. And even now it lurked, a conditioned state of mind, to ambush him at every hidden thicket. How long would it be before the ability would start to wear away? What might be done to wipe it out entirely? How does one unlearn a thing he spent a century in learning? Exactly how dangerous was it? Was there necessity of a conscious thought, an absolute command, or could a man slip into it simply as an involuntary retreat from dreary reality. He must warn the robots. He must talk it over with them. Some sort of emergency measure must be set up to protect him against the wish or urge. Some manner of drastic action be devised to rescue him, should he slip back into the old delusion. Although, he thought, it would be so fine to walk out of the room and down the stairs and find the others waiting for him with the drinks all ready and the talk well started.
"Cut it out!"
he screamed. Wipe it from his mind. That was what he must do. He must not even think of it. He must work so hard that he would have no time to think. Become so tired from work that he'd fall into bed and go to sleep at once and have no chance to dream. He ran through his mind all that must be done. The watching of the incubators, preparing the ground for gardens and for crops, servicing the atomic generators, getting in timbers against the need of building, exploring and mapping and surveying the adjacent territory, overhauling the ship for the one robot return flight to Earth. He filled his mind with it. He tagged items for further thought and action. He planned the days and months and years ahead, and at last he was satisfied. He had it under control. He tied his shoes and finished buttoning his shirt. Then, with a resolute tread, he opened the door and walked out on the landing. A hum of talk floating up the stairway stopped him in his tracks. Fear washed over him. Then the fear evaporated. Gladness burst within him, and he took a quick step forward. At the top of the stairs, he halted and reached out a hand to grasp the banister. Alarm bells were ringing in his brain, and the gladness fell away. There was nothing left but sorrow, a terrible, awful grieving. He could see one corner of the room below, and he could see that it was carpeted. He could see the drapes and paintings and one ornate golden chair. With a moan, he turned and fled to his room. He slammed the door and stood with his back against it. The room was the way it should be, bare and plain and cold. Thank God, he thought. Thank God. A shout came up the stairway. "Winston? What's wrong with you? Winston, hurry up!" Then another voice. "Winston, we're celebrating. We have a suckling pig." And still another voice. "With an apple in its mouth." He didn't answer. They'll go away, he thought. They have to go away. And even as he thought it, half of him, more than half, longed in sudden agony to open up the door and go down the stairs and know once again the old security and the ancient friendship. He found that he had both his hands behind his back, and that they were clutching the doorknob as if they were frozen there. He heard steps on the stairway, the sound of many happy, friendly voices coming up to get him. Beachhead by Clifford D. Simak. There was nothing, absolutely nothing, that could stop a human planetary survey party. It was a highly specialized unit created for and charged with one purpose only: to establish a bridgehead on an alien planet, to blast out the perimeters of the bridgehead and establish a base where there would be some elbow room, then hold that elbow room against all comers until it was time to go. After the base was once established, the brains of the party got to work. They turned the place inside out. They put it on tape and captured it within the chains of symbols that scribbled in their field books. They pictured it and wrote it and plotted it and reduced it to a neat assembly of keyed and symbolic facts to be inserted in the galactic files. If there was life, and sometimes there was, they prodded it to get reaction. Sometimes the reaction was extremely violent, and other times it was much more dangerously subtle. But there were ways in which to handle both the violent and the subtle. For the Legionnaires and the robotics were trained to a razor's edge and knew nearly all the answers. As we were saying, there was nothing in the universe, so far known, that could stop a human survey party. Tom Decker sat at his ease in the empty lounge and swirled the ice in the highball glass. well contented, watching the first of the robots emerge from the bowels of the cargo space. They dragged a conveyor belt behind them as they emerged, and Decker, sitting idly, watched them drive supports into the ground and rig up the belt. A door clicked open back of Decker, and he turned his head. "May I come in, sir?" Doug Jackson asked. "Certainly," said Decker. Jackson walked to the great curving window and looked out. "What does it look like, sir?" Decker shrugged. "Another job," he said. 6 weeks, 6 months. Depends on what we find." Jackson sat down beside him. "This one looks tough," he said. "Jungle worlds always are a bit meaner than any of the others." Decker grunted at him. "A job," he said, "that's all. Another job to do, another report to file. Then they'll either send out an exploitation gang or a pitiful bunch of bleating colonists." "Or," said Jackson, "they'll file the report and let it gather dust for 1,000 years or so." "They can do anything they want," Decker told him. "We turn it in. What someone else does with it after that is their affair, not ours." They sat quietly, watching the 6 robots roll out the first of the packing cases, rip off its cover and unpack the 7th robot, laying out his various parts neatly in a row in the tramped-down waist-high grass. Then, working as a team with not a single fumble, they put number 7 together, screwed his brain case into his metal skull, flipped up his energizing switch, and slapped the breastplate home. Number 7 stood groggily for a moment. He swung his arms uncertainly, shook his head from side to side. Then, having oriented himself, he stepped briskly forward, helped the other 6 heave the packing case containing number 8 off the conveyor belt. "Takes a little time this way," said Decker, "but it saves a lot of space. Have to cut our robot crew in half if we didn't pack them at the end of every job. They stow away better." He sipped at his highball speculatively. Jackson lit a cigarette. "Someday," said Jackson, "we're going to run up against something that we can't handle." Decker snorted. "Maybe here," insisted Jackson, gesturing at the nightmare jungle world outside the great curved sweep of the vision plate. "You're a romanticist," Decker told him shortly. "In love with the unexpected. Besides that, you're new. Get a dozen trips under your belt and you won't feel this way." "It could happen," declared Jackson. Decker nodded, almost sleepily. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe it could at that. It never has, but I suppose it could. And when it does, we take it on the lam. It's no part of our job to fight a last-ditch battle. When we bump up against something that's too big to handle, we don't stick around. We don't take any risks." He had another sip. "Nor even calculated risks," he said. The ship rested on the top of a low hill in a small clearing masked by tall grass, sprinkled here and there with patches of exotic flowers. Below the hill, a river flowed sluggishly, a broad expanse of chocolate-colored water moving in a sleepy tide through the immense vine-entangled forest. As far as the eye could see, the jungle stretched away, a brooding darkness that even from behind the curving quartz of the vision plate seemed to exude a heady, musty scent of danger that swept up over the grass-covered hilltop. There was no sign of life, but one knew, almost instinctively, that sentiency lurked in the buried pathways and tunnels of the great tree land. Robot number 8 had been energized, and now the 8 split into 2 groups, ran out 2 packing boxes at a time instead of 1. Soon there were 12 robots, and then they formed themselves into 3 groups. "Like that," said Decker, picking up the conversation where they had left it lying. He gestured with his glass, now empty. "No calculated risks. We send the robots first. They unpack and set up their fellas. Then the whole gang turns to and uncrates the machinery and sets it up and gets it operating. Man doesn't even put his foot in the ground till he has a steel ring around the ship to give him protection." Jackson sighed. I guess you're right, he said. Nothing can happen. We don't take any chances. Not a single one. Why should we? Decker asked. He heaved himself out of the chair, stood up, and stretched. Got a job or two to do, he said. Last-minute checks, and so on. I'll sit here for a while, said Jackson. I like to watch. I'm new at this. It is fascinating. You'll get over that, said Decker. In another 20 years. In his office, Decker lifted the sheaf of preliminary reports off his desk and ran through them slowly, checking each one carefully, filing away in his mind the basic facts of the world outside. He worked stolidly, wetting a big blunt thumb against his out-thrust tongue to flip the report pages off the top of the neat stack and deposit them in not-so-neat a pile to his right, face downward. Atmosphere, pressure slightly more than Earth, high in oxygen content. Gravity, a bit more than Earth. Temperature, hot. Jungle worlds always were. There was a breeze outside now, he thought. Maybe there'd be a breeze most of the time. That would be a help. Rotation, 36-hour day. Radiation, none of local origin, but some hard stuff getting through from the sun. He made a mental note. Watch that. Bacterial and virus count. As usual, lots of it. Apparently not too dangerous. Not with every single soul hypoed and immunized and hormoned to his eyebrows. But you never can be sure, he thought. Not entirely sure. No calculated risks, he had told Jackson. But here was a calculated risk, and one you couldn't do a single thing about. If there was a bug that picked you for a host, and you weren't loaded for bear to fight him, you took him on and did the best you could. Life factor. A lot of emanations. Probably the vegetation, maybe even the soil, was crawling with all sorts of loathsome life. Vicious stuff, more than likely. But that was something that you took care of as a matter of routine. No use of taking any chances. You went over the ground, even if there was no life, just to be sure there wasn't. A tap came on the door, and he called out for the man to enter. It was Captain Carr, commander of the Legion unit. Carr saluted snappily. Decker did not rise, made his answering salute a sloppy one on purpose. No use, he told himself, of letting the fellow establish any semblance of equality. For there was no equality, in fact. A captain of the Legion did not rank with the commandant of a galactic survey party. "Reporting, sir," said Carr. "We are ready for a landing." Decker rumbled at him. "Fine, Captain, fine." What was the matter with the fool? The Legion always was ready. Always would be ready. That was no more than tradition. Why carry out such an empty, stiff formality? But it was the nature of a man like Carr, he supposed. The Legion, with its rigid discipline, with its ancient pride of service and tradition, attracted men like Carr. It was a perfect finishing school for accomplished martinets. Tin soldiers, Decker thought, but accomplished ones, as hard-bitten a gang of fighting men as the galaxy had ever known. They were drilled and disciplined to a razor's edge. Serum and hormone injected against all known diseases of an alien world, trained and educated in alien psychology, and strictly indoctrinated with high survival characteristics which stood up under even the most adverse circumstances. "We shall not be ready for some time, Captain," Decker said. "The robots have just started uncrating." "Very well," said Carr. "We await your orders, sir." "Thank you, Captain," Decker told him, making it quite clear that he wished he would get out. But when Carr turned to go, Decker called him back. "What is it, sir?" asked Carr. "I've been wondering," said Decker. "Just wondering, you understand. Can you imagine any circumstance which might arise that the Legion could not handle?" Carr's expression was a pure delight to see. "I'm afraid, sir," he said, "I don't understand your question." Decker sighed. "I didn't think you would," he said. Before nightfall, the full working force of robots had been uncrated and had set up some of the machines, enough to establish a small circle of alarm posts around the ship. A flamethrower burned a barren circle on the hilltop, stretching 500 feet around the ship. A hard radiations generator took up its painstaking task, pouring pure death into the soil. The toll must have been terrific. In some spots, the ground virtually boiled as the dying life forms fought momentarily and fruitlessly to escape the death that cut them down. The robots rigged up huge batteries of lamps that set the hilltop ablaze with light as bright as day, and the work went on. As yet, no human had set foot outside the ship. Inside the ship, the robot stewards set up a table in the lounge so that the human diners could see what was going on outside. The entire company, except for the Legionnaires who stayed in quarters, had gathered for the meal when Decker came into the room. "Good evening, gentlemen," he said. He strode to the table's head, and the others ranged themselves along the sides. He sat down. There was a scraping of drawn chairs as the others took their places. He clasped his hands in front of him, and bowed his head, and parted his lips to say the customary words. And then he halted, even as he spoke, and when the words did come, they were different from the ones he had said by rote 1,000 times before. "Dear Father, we are thy servants in an unknown land, and there is a deadly pride upon us. Teach us humility, and lead us to that knowledge, before it is too late, that men, despite their far traveling and their mighty works, still are as children in thy light. Bless the bread we are about to break, we beg thee, and keep us forever in thy compassion. Amen." He lifted his head and looked down the table. Some of them, he saw, were startled. The others were amused. "They wonder if I'm cracking," he thought. "They think the old man's breaking up. And that may be true for all I know. Although I was all right until this afternoon, all right until young Doug Jackson." Platters and plates were being passed up and down the table's length, and there was the commonplace, homely clatter of silverware and china. "This looks an interesting world, sir," said Waldron, the anthropologist. "Dixon and I were up in observation just before the sunset. We thought we saw something down by the river, some sort of life." Decker grunted, scooping fried potatoes out of the bowl onto his plate. "Funny, if we don't run across a lot of life here. The radiation wagon stirred up a lot of it when we went over the field today." "What Waldron and I saw," said Dixon, "looked humanoid." Decker squinted at the biologist. "Sure of that?" he asked. Dixon shook his head. "The seeing was poor. Could not be absolutely sure. Seemed to me there were 2 or 3 of them. Matchstick men." Waldron nodded. "Like a picture a kid would draw," he said. "1 stroke for the body, 2 strokes each for arms and legs, a circle for a head, angular, ungraceful, skinny." "Graceful enough in motion, though," said Dixon. "When they moved, they went like cats, flowed, sort of." "We'll know plenty soon enough," Decker told them mildly. "In a day or 2, we'll flush them." Funny, he thought. On almost every job, someone popped up to report he had spotted humanoids. Usually there weren't any. Usually it was just imagination. Probably wishful thinking, he told himself. The yen of men far away from their fellow men, to find in an alien place a type of life that somehow seemed familiar. Although the usual humanoid, once you met him in the flesh, turned out to be so repulsively alien that alongside him an octopus would seem positively human. Franey, the senior geologist, said, "Been thinking about those mountains in the west of us. The ones we caught sight of when we were coming in. Had a new look about them. New mountains are good to work in. They haven't worn down. Easier to get at whatever's in them." "We'll lay out our first survey lines in that direction," Decker told him. Outside the curving vision plate, the night was alive with the blaze of the batteries of lights. Gleaming robots toiled in shining gangs. Ponderous machines lumbered past. Smaller ones scurried like frightened beetles. To the south, great gouts of flame leaped out, and the sky was painted red with the bursts of a squad of flamethrowers going into action. "Chewing out a landing field," said Decker. "A tongue of forest juts out there. Absolutely level ground like a floor. Won't take a great deal of work to turn it into a field." The stewards brought coffee and brandy and a box of good cigars. Decker and his men settled back in their chairs, taking life easy, watching the work going on outside the ship. "I hate this waiting," Franey said, settling down comfortably to a cigar. "Part of the job," said Decker, poured some more brandy into his coffee. By dawn, the last machines were set up and either had been moved out to their assigned positions or were parked in the motor pool. The flamers had enlarged the burned-over area, and 3 radiation wagons were busy on their rounds. To the south, the airfield had been finished, and the jets were lined up and waiting in a plumb straight line. Some of the robots, their work done for the moment, formed themselves into solid ranks to shape a solid square, neat and orderly and occupying a minimum of space. They stood there in the square, waiting against the time when they would be needed, a motor pool of robots, a reservoir of manpower. Finally, the gangplank came down, and the Legionnaires marched out in files of 2, with clank and glitter and remorseless precision that put all machines to shame. There were no banners, and there were no drums, for these were useless things, and the Legion, despite its clank and glitter, was an organization of ruthless efficiency. The column wheeled and became a line, and the line broke up, and the platoons moved out toward the planet head perimeter. There, machine and Legionnaire and robot manned the frontier Earth had set up on an alien world. Busy robots staked out and set up an open-air pavilion of gaudy striped canvas that rippled in the breeze, set up tables and chairs beneath the shading canvas, moved out a refrigerator filled with refreshments, with extra ice compartments. It was finally safe and comfortable for ordinary men to leave the shelter of the ship. Organization, Decker told himself. Organization and efficiency, and leaving not a thing to chance. Plug every loophole before it was a loophole. Crush possible resistance before it could become resistance. Gain absolute control over a certain number of square feet of planet, and operate from there. Later, of course, there were certain chances taken. You couldn't eliminate them all. There would be field trips, and even with all precautions that robot and machine and Legionnaires could offer, there would be certain risks. There would be aerial mapping and surveys, and these too would have elements of chance, but with those elements reduced to the very minimum. And always there would be the base, an absolutely safe and impregnable base to which a field party or a survey flight could retreat, from which reinforcements could be sent out or counteraction taken. Foolproof, he told himself, as foolproof as it could be made. He wondered briefly what had been the matter with him the night before. It had been that young fool Jackson, of course, a capable biochemist, possibly, but certainly the wrong kind of man for a job like this. Something had slipped up. The screening board should have stopped a man like Jackson, should have spotted his emotional instability. Not that he could do any actual harm, of course, but he could be upsetting. An irritant, said Decker. That's what he is. Just an irritant. Decker laid an armful of paraphernalia on the long table underneath the gay pavilion. From it he selected a rolled-up sheet of map paper, unrolled it, spread it flat, and thumbtacked it at 4 corners. On it a portion of the river and the mountains to the westward had been roughly penciled in. The base was represented by a crossed-through square, and the rest of it was blank. But it would be filled in. As the days went by, it would take on shape and form. From the field to the south, a jet whooshed up into the sky, made a lazy turn, and straightened out to streak toward the west. Decker walked to the edge of the pavilion's shade and watched as it dwindled out of sight. That would be Jarvis and Donnelly, assigned to the preliminary survey of the southwest sector between the base and the western mountains. Another jet rose lazily, trailing its column of exhaust, gathered speed and sprang into the sky. Freeman and Johns, he thought. Decker went back to the table, pulled out a chair and sat down. He picked up a pencil and tapped it idly on the almost blank map paper. Behind his back he heard another jet whoom upward from the field. He let his eyes take in the base. Already it was losing its raw, burned-over look. Already it had something of the look of Earth about it, of the efficiency and common sense and get-the-job-done attitude of the man of Earth. Small groups of men stood about the base talking. One of them, he saw, was squatted on the ground, talking things over with 3 squatting robots. Others of them walked about, giving orders, planning, sizing up the situation. Decker grunted with satisfaction. A capable gang of men, he thought. Most of them would have to wait around to really get down to work until the first surveys came in. But even while they waited, they would not be idle. They'd take soil samples and test them. The life that swarmed in the soil would be captured and brought in by grinning robots, and the squirming, vicious things would be pinned down and investigated, photographed, x-rayed, dissected, analyzed, observed, put through reaction tests. Trees and plant and grasses would be dug for a look at the soil strata. The river's water would be analyzed. Scenes would dredge up some of the life it held. Wells would be driven to establish water tables. All of this here at the moment, while they waited for the first preliminary flights to bring back data that would pinpoint other areas worthy of investigation. Once those reports were in, the work would be started in dead earnest. Geologists and mineral men would probe into the planet's hide. Weather observation points would be set up. Botanists would take far-ranging check samples. Each man would do the work for which he had been trained. Field reports would pour back to the base, and they would be correlated and fitted into the picture. Work then. Work in plenty. Work by day and night. And all the time the base would be a bit of Earth. A few square yards held inviolate against all another world might muster. Decker sat easily in his chair and felt the breeze that came beneath the canvas. A gentle breeze that ruffled through his hair, rattled the papers on the table, and twitched the tacked-down map. It was pleasant here, he thought. But it wouldn't stay pleasant for long. It almost never did. Someday, he thought, I'll find a pleasant planet, a paradise planet where the weather's always perfect, and there's food for the picking of it, and natives that are intelligent to talk with, and companionable in other ways, and I will never leave it. I'll refuse to leave when the ship is ready to cast off. I'll live out my days in a fascinating corner of a lousy galaxy. A galaxy that is gaunt with hunger and mad with savagery and lonely beyond all that can be said of loneliness. He looked up from his reverie and saw Jackson standing at the pavilion's edge, watching him. "What's the matter, Jackson?" Decker asked with sudden bitterness. "Why aren't you—" "They're bringing in a native, sir," said Jackson, breathlessly. "One of the things Waldron and Dixon saw. The robots caught him, sir." The native was humanoid, but he was not human. As Waldron and Dixon had said, he was a matchstick man, a flesh-and-blood extension of a drawing a 4-year-old might make. He was black as the ace of spades, and he wore no clothing, but the eyes that looked out of the pumpkin-shaped head at Decker were bright with light that might have been intelligence. Decker tensed as he looked into those eyes. Then he looked away, saw the men standing silently around the pavilion's edge, silent and waiting, tense as he was. Slowly, Decker reached out his hand to one of the twin headsets of the mentograph. His fingers closed over it, and for a moment he felt a vague but forceful reluctance to put it on his head. It was disturbing to contact, or attempt to contact, an alien mind. It gave one a queasy feeling in the pit of the stomach. It was a thing, he thought, that men never had been intended to do. An experience that was utterly foreign to any human background. He lifted the headset slowly, fitted it over his skull, made a sign toward the second set. For a moment the alien eyes watched him, the creature standing erect and motionless. Courage, thought Decker. Raw and naked courage to stand here in this suddenly unfamiliar environment that had blossomed almost overnight on familiar ground, to stand here motionless and erect, surrounded by creatures that must look as if they had dropped from some horrific nightmare. The humanoid took one step closer to the table, reached out a hand, and took the headset. Fumbling with its unfamiliarity, he clamped it on his head, and never, for a moment, did the eyes waver from Decker's eyes, always alert and watchful. Decker forced himself to relax, tried to force his mind into an attitude of peace and calm. That was a thing you had to be careful of. You couldn't scare the critters. You had to lull them, quiet them down, make them feel your friendliness. They would be upset and humpy. A sudden thought, even a suggestion of human brusqueness, would wind them up tighter than a drum. There was intelligence here, he told himself, being careful to keep his mind unruffled. A greater intelligence than one would think looking at the creature. Intelligence enough to know that he should put on the headset. Guts enough to do it. He caught the first faint mental whiff of the matchstick man, and the pit of his stomach contracted suddenly, and there was an ache around his belly. There was nothing in the thing he caught, nothing that could be put in words, but there was an alienness, as a smell is alien. There was a non-human connotation that set one's teeth on edge. He fought back the gagging blackness of repulsive disgust that sought to break the smooth friendliness he held within his mind. We are friendly, Decker forced himself to think. We are friendly, we are friendly, we are friendly, we are friendly, we are... You should not have come, said the thought of the matchstick man. We will not harm you, Decker thought. We are friendly. We will not harm you. We will not harm you. You will never leave, said the humanoid. Let's be friends, thought Decker. Let's be friends. We have gifts. We will help you. We will... You should not have come, said the matchstick thought. But since you are here, you can never leave. Humor him, Decker told himself. Humor him, humor him. All right then, he thought. We will stay. We will stay, and we will be friendly. We will stay and teach you. We will give you the things that we have brought for you, and we will stay with you. You will not leave, said the matchstick man's thought. And there was something so cold and logical and matter-of-fact about the way the thought was delivered that Decker suddenly was cold. The humanoid meant it, meant every word of the thing he said. He was not being dramatic, nor was he blustering, and neither was he bluffing. He actually thought that the humans would not leave, that they would not live to leave the planet. Decker smiled softly to himself. You will die here, said the humanoid thought. Die? Asked Decker. What is die? The matchstick man's thought was pure disgust. Deliberately he reached up and took off the headset, laid it carefully back upon the table. Then he turned and walked away, and not a man made a move to stop him. Decker took off his headset, slammed it on the tabletop. Jackson, he said, pick up a phone and tell the Legion to let him through. Let him leave. Don't try to stop him. He sat limply in his chair and looked at the ring of faces that was watching him. Waldron asked, What is it, Decker? He sentenced us to death, said Decker. He said he would not allow us to leave the planet. He said that we would die here. Strong words, said Waldron. He meant them, Decker said. He lifted a hand, flipped it wearily. He doesn't know, of course, he said. He really thinks he can stop us leaving. He thinks that we will die. It was an amusing situation, really, that a naked humanoid should walk out of the jungle and threaten to kill a human survey party. That he should really think that he could do it. That he should be positive about it. But there was not a single smile on any of the faces that looked at Decker. We can't let it get us, Decker said.
Nevertheless, Waldron declared, we should take all precautions.
Decker nodded. We'll go on emergency alert immediately, he said. We'll stay that way until we're sure, He halted angrily. Sure of what? Sure that an alien savage who wore no clothing, who had not a sign of culture about him, could wipe out a group of humans protected by a ring of steel, held within a guard of machine and robots and a group of fighting men who knew all there was to know concerning the refinement of dealing out swift and merciless extermination to anything that moved against them? Ridiculous? Of course it was ridiculous. And yet the eyes had held intelligence. The being had had not only intelligence but courage. He had stood within a circle of what, to him, were alien beings, and he had not flinched. He had faced the unknown and said what there was to say, and then had walked away with a dignity any human would have been proud to wear. He had known that the alien beings within the confines of the base were not of his own planet, for he had said they should not have come, and his thought had implied that he was aware they were not of this world of his. He had understood that he was supposed to put on the headset, but whether that was an act more of courage than of intelligence, one would never know, for you could not know if he had realized what the headset had been for. Not knowing, the naked courage of clamping it to his head was an order that could not be measured. "What do you think?" Decker asked Waldron.
"We'll have to be careful," Waldron told him evenly. "We'll have to watch our step, take all precautions now that we're warned. But there's nothing to be scared of, nothing we can't handle." "He was bluffing," Dixon said, "trying to scare us into leaving."
Decker shook his head. "I don't think he was," he said. "I tried to bluff him, and it didn't work. He's just as sure as we are." The work went on. There was no attack. The jets roared out and thrummed away, mapping the land. Field parties went out cautiously. They were flanked by robots and by legionnaires and preceded by lumbering machines that knifed and tore and burned a roadway through even the most stubborn of the terrain they went up against. Radio weather stations were set up at distant points, and at the base the weather tabulators clicked off the data that the stations sent back. Other field parties were flown into the special areas pinpointed for more extensive exploration and investigation. And nothing happened. The days went past. The weeks went past. The machines and robots watched, and the legionnaires stood ready, and the men hurried with their work to get off the planet. A bed of coal was found and mapped. An iron range was discovered. An area in the mountains to the west crawled with radioactive ores. The botanists found 27 species of edible fruits. The base swarmed with animals that had been trapped as specimens and remained as pets. And a village of the matchstick men was found. It wasn't much of a place. Its huts were primitive. Its sanitation was non-existent. Its people were peaceful. Decker left his chair under the striped pavilion to lead a party to the village. The party entered cautiously, weapons ready, but being very careful not to move too fast, not to speak too quickly, not to make a motion that might be construed as hostile. The natives sat in their doorways and watched them. They did not speak, and they did not move. They simply watched the humans as they marched to the center of the village. Then the robot set up a table and placed a mentograph upon it. Decker sat down in a chair and put one of the headsets on his skull. The rest of the party drew up into a line and waited. Decker waited, and the others waited, and the natives sat in their doorways watching. They waited for an hour, and not a native stirred. None came forward to put on the other headset. Decker waved his hand wearily, took off the headset. "It's no use," he said. "It won't work. Go ahead and take your pictures, do anything you wish, but don't disturb the natives. Don't touch a single thing." He took a handkerchief out of his pocket and mopped his steaming face. Waldron came up and leaned on the table. "What do you make of it?" he asked. Decker shook his head. "It haunts me," he said. "There's just one thing I am thinking. It must be wrong. It can't be right. But I thought of it, and I can't get rid of it."
Sometimes that happens, Waldron said. No matter how illogical a thing may be, it sticks with a man like a burr inside his brain.
I thought, said Decker, that they have told us all that they have to tell us, that they have nothing more they wish to say to us.
That's what you thought, said
Waldron. Decker nodded. A funny thing to think, he said. Out of clear sky. And it can't be right.
I don't know, said Waldron. Nothing's right here. Notice that they haven't got a single iron tool, not a single scrap of metal in evidence at all. Their cooking utensils are stone, a sort of funny stuff like soapstone. What few tools they have are stone.
And yet, Decker told him, they're intelligent. Look at their eyes. Intelligence there, if you ever saw it. And that fellow who came into the base, he knew what to do with the headset. He knew that we didn't belong in the planet. Waldron sucked thoughtfully at a back tooth.
"We better be getting back to base," he said. "It's getting late."
He held his wrist in front of him.
"My watch has stopped," he said. "What time do you have, Decker?"
Decker's arm came up, and Waldron heard the sharp gasp of his breath. Slowly Decker raised his head, looked at the other man. "My watch has stopped too," he said. And his voice was scarcely louder than a whisper. For a moment they were graven images, eyes matching eyes. And then Waldron jerked his head away.
"Assemble," he shouted. "Back to the base, quick!"
The men came running. The robots fell into place. The column marched away. The natives sat in their doorway and watched them leave. Decker sat in his camp chair and listened to the canvas of the pavilion snapping softly in the wind, alive in the wind, talking and laughing to itself. The lantern, hung on the ring above his head, swayed gently and cast fleeting shadows that seemed at times to be the shadows of living, moving things. A robot stood quietly by one of the pavilion poles. Stolidly, Decker reached out a finger and stirred the little pile of wheels and springs that lay upon the table. Sinister, he thought. Sinister and queer. The guts of watches lying on the table. Not of two watches alone, not only his and Waldron's watches, but many other watches from the wrists of other men, all of them silent, stilled in their task of marking time. Night had fallen hours before, but the base still was astir with activity that was at once feverish and furtive. Men moved about in the shadows and crossed the glaring patches of brilliance shed by the banks of light set up by the robots many weeks before. Watching them, one would have sensed that they moved with a haunting sense of doom, and one would have known as well that they knew, deep in their inmost hearts, that there was no doom to fear, no definite thing that one could put a finger on and say, this is the thing to fear, no direction that one could point and say, doom lies out there waiting to leap upon us. Just one small thing. Watches had stopped running. And that was a simple thing for which there must be some simple explanation. Except, thought Decker, on an alien planet, no occurrence, no accident or incident can be regarded as a simple thing for which a simple explanation must necessarily be anticipated. For the matrix of cause and effect, the mathematics of chance, may not hold true on alien planets as they hold true on Earth. There was one rule, Decker thought grimly. One rule. Take no chances. That was the one safe rule to follow, the only rule to follow. Following it, he had ordered all field parties back to the base, ordered the crew to prepare the ship for emergency takeoff, had alerted the robots to be ready at an instant to get the machines aboard, to even desert the machines and leave without them if circumstances should dictate that such was necessary. Having done that, there was no more to do but wait. Wait until the field parties came back from their advance camps. Wait until some reason could be assigned to the failure of the watches. It was not a thing, he told himself, that should be allowed to panic one. It was a thing to recognize, not to disregard. It was a thing which made necessary a certain number of precautions, but it was not a thing that should make one lose all sense of proportion. You could not go back to Earth and say, "Well, you see, our watches stopped, and so—" A footstep sounded, and he swung around in his chair. It was Jackson. "What is it, Jackson?" Decker asked. "The camps aren't answering, sir," said Jackson. "The operator has been trying to raise them, and there is no answer. Not a single peep." Decker grunted. "Take it easy," he said. "They will answer. Give them time." He wished, even as he spoke, that he could feel some of the assurance that he tried to put into his voice. For a second, a rising terror mounted in his throat, and he choked it back. "Sit down. We'll sit here and have a beer, and then we'll go down to the radio shack, and we'll see what's stirring." He rapped on the table. "Beer," he said. "2 beers." The robot standing by the pavilion pole did not answer. He made his voice louder. The robot did not stir. Decker put his fist upon the table and tried to rise, but his legs suddenly were cold and had turned to water, and he could not raise himself. "Jackson," he panted, "go and tap that robot on the shoulder. Tell him we want some beer." He saw the fear that whitened Jackson's face as he rose and moved slowly forward. Inside himself, starting in the pit of his belly and rising to worry at his throat, he felt the same whiplash terror that Jackson must have felt. Jackson stood beside the robot and reached out a hesitant hand, tapped him gently on the shoulder, tapped him harder, and the robot fell flat upon his face. Feet hammered across the hard-packed earth, heading toward the pavilion. Decker jerked himself around, sat 4 square and solid in his chair, waiting. It was MacDonald, chief engineer. He stopped at the table's edge and gripped its boards with 2 grimy hands. His face was twisted, as if he were about to weep. "The ship, sir. The ship." Decker nodded, almost idly. "I know, Mr. MacDonald. The ship won't run." MacDonald gulped. "The big stuff's all right, sir. But the little gadgets, the injector mechanism, the—" He stopped and stared at Decker. "You knew?" he said. "How did you know?" "I knew," said Decker, "that it would come someday. Not like this, perhaps, but in any one of several ways. I knew that the day would come when our luck would run too thin, when we'd cover all the possibilities but the one that we could not suspect. And that, of course, would be the one that would ruin us." He was thinking. The natives had no metal, no sign of any metal in their camp at all. Their dishes were soapstone, and they wore no ornaments. Their implements were stone, and yet they were intelligent enough, civilized enough, cultured enough to have fabricated metal. For there was metal here, a great deposit of it in the western mountains. They tried, perhaps, many centuries ago, had fashioned metal tools and metal ornaments and had them go to pieces underneath their fingers after a few short weeks. Waldron came into the pavilion on cat-like feet. "The radio's dead," he said, "and the robots are dying like flies. The place is littered with them, just so much scrap steel." Decker nodded. "The little stuff, the finely fabricated, will go first, like watches and radio innards and robot brains and injector mechanisms. After that, it will be the big stuff. The ship will melt into a heap of slag." "The native told us when you had him up here," Waldron said. "You will never leave," he said. "We didn't understand," said Decker. "We thought he was threatening us, and we knew that we were too big, too well guarded for any threat of his to harm us. He wasn't threatening us at all, of course. He was just telling us, warning us maybe, although even then it might have been too late. He might have even felt sorry for us." He made a hopeless gesture with his hand. "What is it?" he asked.
No one knows, said Waldron quietly. Not yet, at least. We may find out later, but it won't help us any. A microbe, maybe, a virus, something that eats iron after it has been subjected to heat or alloyed with other metals. Something that won't tolerate alloyed metal on the planet. It doesn't go for iron ore. If it did, that deposit we found would have been gone long ago. Possibly the radioactive ore as well.
How does it survive? Asked Decker. Without stuff to eat, how does it live?
I wouldn't know, said Waldron. It might not be a metal-eating organism at all. It might be something else, something in the atmosphere.
We tested the atmosphere. But even as the words left his mouth, Decker saw how foolish they were. They had tested the atmosphere. But how could they have detected something they had never run across before? Man's yardstick was limited to the things he knew about, limited by the circle of his own experience. He guarded himself against the obvious and the imaginable. He could not guard himself against the unknowable or the unimaginable. Decker stood up and saw Jackson standing by the pavilion pole, with the robot stretched out at his feet, his metal hide gleaming in the shine of the swaying lantern. You have your answer, he told the biochemist. Remember that first day? You talked with me in the lounge? Jackson nodded. I remember, sir, he said. His voice was quiet. And suddenly, Decker realized the entire base was quiet. A gust of wind came out of the jungle and rattled the canvas and set the lantern to swaying violently. Now, for the first time since they had landed, he caught in the wind the alien smell of an alien world.